Hi folks, welcome to another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Jim Thompson and Douglas Mackenzie here again to talk to one of our cronies from around the Burns world. Hi Jim, how are you doing?
Doing lovely, Douglas. Absolutely brilliant. Thanks very much.
Good. Tonight, folks, we've got a former president from the bicentenary year of the Dumfries South Burns Club. Please welcome tonight's guest, Peter Kormylo.
Good evening, all.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Douglas. Very well.
Good. Well, Peter, when we do these podcasts, we always ask the same question, and it's, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, certainly. My membership with the Burns House Club goes back some 35 years, when I was first encouraged to join by the one and only Wilson Ogilvie, who at that time was president of the Federation. And he was a fellow head teacher. And in his school and in my school, Robert Burns was the favoured poet among the primary school children. And of course, Wilson and I took part every year in the regional competitions. And because of that, we together managed to form a nucleus of people that were very supportive of the bairns learning excerpts from Rabi's poems. So 35 years back, and then of course, once I was in the House Club, I managed to join the committee, and then eventually, after attendance at many committee meetings, along came the bicentenary year, and I was lucky enough to follow Graham Davidson into the chair, and I had a marvellous year, gentlemen, because as you know, the high point of that year was both up in your territory and down here, with many people visiting Dumfries, visiting the mausoleum, Burns's house, the Burns Centre, and taking part in quite a number of activities to do with the Bard himself. So it was a very interesting presidency. And during that time, and this is how I managed to become the honorary librarian for the next 10 years, during that bicentenary year, I had the privilege of inviting quite a number of well-known authors to the Burns House Club, to our, what we called in those days, the literary evenings. And I managed to get hold of people like Billy Kay, Professor Noble, Patrick Hogg, Scott Hogg, people like that to come down and lead conversations around some of the poems and books that have been written about Robert Burns. And, you know, it was an extension really of my very first interest in the poet, which started when I was a teenager, because in those far off distant days, you could study Burns for the hire. And so I approached my English language teacher, and said, look, I know I can be doing Shakespeare and Chaucer and all of these other wonderful people. I said, but I would really like to sit my hire around Robert Burns's poetry. And the first thing he said to me was, well, you're going to have to learn to speak Scots. And because I went to a decent school where they spoke a very standard form of Scottish dialect, nothing as dialectal as deepest, darkest Dumfriesshire or Ayrshire. But
and was that school in Annan? Did you say it was Annan that you?
No, that was
born
Dumfries.
And brought up?
No, I was born and brought up in Annan, but I went to secondary school in Dumfries. I went to St. Joseph's College in Dumfries, and it was run by Maris Brothers. And it was Brother Thaddeus who was mad keen on Scots poetry. and even more keen on Robert Burns. And so I sat the higher, and I'm pleased to tell you, gentlemen, I managed to pass it. And that launched me into a lifelong interest in reading Burns, because as you know, the extensive collection of Burns's poetry and his letters requires quite some considerable time to soak it all up. And I can say that even now, and I turned 71 there in September, even now I'm still discovering some fantastic lines, letters, etc. So it definitely is a lifelong commitment to that form of literature that really is inspiring. And I think,
and you said your interest started as a teenager. Did you come across Burns at all in your primary school?
No, I didn't actually. And the reason was my primary teachers were English by nationality. They couldn't speak Scots, and they certainly couldn't speak Annan. So we had a language problem. However, the transition to Scots for me wasn't too difficult, because my granny, my mother is Scottish, but my granny was from Cumbria. And as you know, the Cumbrians speak a form of Scots. So when she told people that, you know, our Peter's sick a grand lad, then you knew what she was saying, or Lyle Bugger, or whatever Cumbrian phrase came away from my granny's lips could be translated easily into the Scots. As you know, you've mentioned my surname, and I think it's important to tell you that my daddy was Ukrainian, but my mother was undoubtedly Scottish. And like myself, born and bred in Annan.
I'm pleased to hear about that Cumbrian heritage, because I also have a Cumbrian heritage. My family, and my mother's family, was from Whitehaven on the coast.
They're fantastic people. Douglas, I've got pals down there, and when I go down there, if they're speaking broad Cumbrian, as they do in the Lake District, you know, it's so easy for us to understand.
Yeah.
And I only found out recently that when Bonnie Prince Charlie was heading down to London with the Klansmen, that quite a few people in Cumbria joined him. So there was an affinity there. And also, if you know the history of Carlisle, the history of the border reivers, you can see all the links between Cumbria and Dumfriesshire and the borders. You know, at one time, as you know from your historical knowledge, it was called the Debatable Lands.
Yeah.
And you didn't know whether you were in Scotland or England, you know?
Yeah.
So I once asked Jim Heenan about that, and he said, look, he said, the border reivers actually went down south to steal the women. He said, but when he saw the women, they took the cattle instead. And there's another pal of mine that I love going to Burns suppers with, Jim Heenan. He's probably one of the funniest men that you could ever meet, and far more in demand than myself, with his toasts to drouthy cronies and the lassies. So there you are. That's my association with, or my kickoff with Rabbie Burns.
Well, tell us a bit about the other aspects of your education. You know, what other subjects did you study, and what happened when you left school?
All right. Well, when I left, actually, my grandmother wanted me to be a joiner, but my dad, being a prisoner of war, he realized that I wasn't going to get anywhere unless I studied. So I went to university. I got a teaching degree and spent quite a long time teaching. Then I became a head teacher, and then eventually an education officer. And my last 10 years, I spent working for the Scottish Government as a senior education advisor. And that was a really interesting post, because I was in a position where I could influence some of the schools to focus on the Scots language and also on Burns. So I've had a career basically in education and jumped a few rungs there. That's my kind of professional background. But all through those years, Douglas, I had the pleasure of listening to Burns reciting Burns at all the regional competitions. And I can tell you, the poet's works are in good hands, especially when you hear some of these Burns from up the Nith Valley. They're really super kids. And in fact, here's the thing, and I've done Burns suppers all over the world. I said to the parents, you know, if your child's good at Burns and they recite and they sing or they play a musical instrument, I said, not only will they get to Burns suppers in and around Scotland, but as they grow older, they'll find themselves getting invited abroad. And I can tell you that has happened. The number of my past pupils that have been invited to different places, different countries to perform at Burns suppers. It's just marvelous. They're like wee ambassadors for Scotland.
Tremendous. You mentioned earlier on that your father had been a prisoner of war, and that gave you the Ukraine connection.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it'll come as no surprise to you that I can speak my father's language, simply because when I was at home as a child, he spoke to me in his language, and my mother spoke to me in her own version of English. And throughout my life, I've had a strong connection with Burns enthusiasts in Ukraine. And I still do have that. We've got Taya Khripleva in Poltava, and we've got Hanna Deka in Kiev, and you know it as Kiev, we pronounce it as Kyiv. And both these ladies have had Burns clubs in their schools for years. And in fact, how I met them was really interesting. I was, with my job, I was in Kiev, and my boss was talking to the Minister of Education in Kiev, and he said, well, you'll need to visit some local schools. So we went up to school number 56. And when I got into the school, I was greeted by two children playing the bagpipes and invited to a ceilidh. And these were Ukrainian children, right, who could recite Robert Burns, knew his CV back to front, and could play musical instruments and promote the tunes and the music of Burns. So following that, I said to Hannah, if you're keen on Burns and I'm keen on Burns, why don't we do this? So we together collected all the poems that had been translated into Ukrainian over the last 200 years by all the famous literateurs. And we produced a book called Robert Burns Selected Works. And we published that book in 2010. We launched it in Kiev, and I'm delighted to tell you of the 4,000 copies that we had, they're gone. They went.
Excellent.
They went like snow off a dike. And the beauty of them was we had the Burns on the left-hand page, and we had the Ukrainian on the right. And I've got copies of them. There's one here. And it was sponsored by the Burns Health Club, and mostly the past presidents of the Health Club. But I don't know if you can see that.
Excellent. Yeah, it's fine.
Robert Burns Selected Works Vebrane, and John, oh God, I've forgotten. Hold on, I'll just have a wee look, because my memory is terrible. John Clark John Clark's our artist and resident kind of poet, and he produced this wonderful front for this. And as I can show you inside, you maybe see it's
yeah.
it's easy for students of language to read, because as you're reading the Burns, you look across and you see the Ukrainian, or vice versa. You read the Ukrainian and you look across and see the Burns. So that book went beautifully.
Yeah.
Right.
Peter, see what you're talking about that. Did you have any input to this one?
No, that's in Russian.
Ah, right.
Jim, the reason that I produced this one, I'll tell you why I produced this one. When I was the librarian of the Howth, I was sick to death of hearing about Samuel Marshak. Everybody that did anything to do with Russia quoted Samuel Marshak. And I said, listen, we had guys on the go doing all this long before Marshak was born. And somebody says, aye, that'll be right. And I said, okay, then I'll go and get the stuff. So Hannah and I put these 200 poems together. And some of them were translated literally years after Burns died. So, and the reason I wanted to do that as well is I was trying to promote Burns in Ukraine. And I'm pleased to tell you that both Hannah's school and Taya's school are part of our Burns Federation children's competition.
Excellent.
All right, so I'm very, very pleased about that.
Well done, well done. We've got into Burns early in this podcast, so I'm going to get Jim to talk to you a bit more about your involvement in Burns. But before we do, I saw a member of your family wander over and lie down on the cushion behind you. So
Yeah.
our viewers would be keen to be introduced. What's the dog's name?
Well, this wee dog's called Star. And Star is a wee rescue dog, right? And I got her from the Edinburgh Dogs Home. There was a very nasty lady throwing this wee dog out of first floor windows.
Oh dear,
And the RSPCA rescued her. And when we got her back here, she's covered in scars from being thrown about and scalded and kicked and all sorts of stuff. Now, I wanted to call her Shrapnel, but my wife's got to called her Star. So she's stuck with the Star bit. But I can tell you, she is a fantastic little friend.
Ah, excellent.
She's a beautiful wee dog. She loves everybody. In fact, she's so friendly that if I let her off the lead, she'd go away with a total stranger. You know what I mean? But she gives me phenomenal pleasure. And I've had her now for 7 years.
Aye.
So
what kind of dog is she?
She's a mixture. She's half a pug and half a Chihuahua. So she's a lovely wee thing, aren't you?
Fantastic.
She can almost, well, did you know that dogs have a vocabulary of 100 words?
No, I didn't know that.
Well, they do, and I didn't know that either. And somebody told me that. I didn't believe them. But I can tell you, after living with this one for 7 years, I'm sure her vocabulary is even bigger than that. And she can spell.
Excellent. You mentioned your wife there. Did you get your wife involved in Burns as well?
Oh, yes. My wife, she'll tell you, she follows me around the globe to Burns suppers here, there, and everywhere. And actually, Leslie's a very good singer. So at some of the suppers that are maybe smaller, because although she's a good singer, she's shy. She doesn't like a big crowd. But if we have a Burns supper that's like sort of extended family size, then Leslie will sing. So, and she used to be in a band and sang, you know, in a band years and years ago, before I met her, of course. I introduced her to the culture of Scots song, because it used to be, she used to sing pop songs. No, but she's keen, and she, you know, she's all I can say is that I've been to places with Leslie. Come and see.
I
Come
used
here,
to sing.
come here and tell them.
I used to sing Scottish songs at the musical festival.
Hi, Leslie. How you doing?
Hi. I used to sing Scottish songs at the musical festival when I was.
She used to
young.
try and win prizes. But anyway,
But I
she,
only came second, never first.
oh dear,
Oh dear.
that is a wrist slitter. That.
Oh, I know.
No, she comes to
what-
burn suppers, don't you, darling?
Yes.
And
Yes.
she doesn't complain if the burn suppers are in very nice locations.
No.
For example, I took it
New York,
in New York a couple of years ago before COVID.
Dubai.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm going to call you back to sing a song.
Nice to meet you, Leslie.
Right.
Okay, we started getting to Burns a wee bit there, and normally Jim leads that part of the conversation, so I'll pass over to Jim now to talk to you further about it.
Right.
Peter, you and I first spent sort of quality time together really through Taya and Hannah from the Ukraine. Are you still involved over there?
Yes. Hannah and Taya keep me in touch with what they're doing with their kids. So we email each other, maybe once every 2 months. But they're both, every time I go to Kiev, they come across to meet me. Hannah lives in Kiev, but Taya comes a long way from Poltava. It's a good 200 or 300 miles.
Right.
But they're very, they now are independent, Jim. I used to do a lot of helping, but they're on their own 2 feet now. And they contact the Federation directly.
Yeah, they're constant contact with me by email as well. They're lovely people. But
Yeah.
I mean, being an Annan boy and born and brought up in Annan, there must be Burns and Annan stories that you can regale the audience with.
Well, obviously Annan's a place that has burn suppers. There's various burn suppers around town, and not to mention particular names, but you can attend a burn supper at any rung of the social hierarchy, if you understand.
I think I do.
That ranges from the likes of Poosie Nancy's to somewhere further up the rung, up the ladder. And that's the good thing. One of the strengths of Annan, I think, is the family burn supper. You'll often hear folks saying, "Oh, we're having a burn supper in the house," and you can only get so many people, in your kitchen or your whatever, in your living room, or wherever you decide to lay the table. But Annan's that kind of place. There are some big burn suppers. And of course, the Annan Ladies Burns Club is, a pillar of strength with regard to that. And there's also the Solway Burns Club, which is linked to Annan. But having lived in Dumfries during my adult life, I'm mostly associated with Dumfries and its immediate environment. Obviously, I have the formal ones like the Howth Club or Dumfries Burns Club or St. Michael's. But there are village burn suppers that I've been to that have been absolutely fantastic. There's a lot of talent out there.
What was, just to remind people, what was Burns' connection with Annan?
Well, Burns, as you know, was an excise-man. And Annan had a thriving port, right? And there was also, as you would guess, with regard to Annan, a little bit of smuggling going on. But the port was very busy. And these clippers were bringing in brandy and wine from France. So he was going down there to check, the imported stuff. And again, I think I mentioned it earlier, it's where Burns wrote The Deals Awa, the Exciseman, because he was there as an exciseman in Annan. And I think he had quite an interesting time winding his way down and back up Port Street, which is a rather long street. Anyway, so going back to village burn suppers, some of the village halls, you'll have been to these, gentlemen. They have a lovely setup. It's usually in a hall that has a wee stage, and you'll end up at the top table, which really is the top table, which is on a stage. And you get a panoramic view of the audience. And these are Kuthi and Kanti. I love them because, like myself, you'll have both been to very prestigious burns suppers that, you know, there's hundreds of people there. The atmosphere is completely different. It's very much intimidating for the speakers, whereas at a village hall, you feel as though you're part of the village. So I very much enjoy them. So there we are.
Well, now you've been involved with burns for a long time. Do you have any personal favourite poems or songs?
Yes, I have. My favourite longer poem is actually Death and Dr. Hornbook. My favourite shorter poem is To a Mouse. And I'm not going to call this a song, although it's generally considered to be a song. But for me, Scots Wha Hae is actually a poem. It's a battle cry. And if you've seen it delivered properly, I mean, Mel Gibson, Eat Your Heart Out, you couldn't possibly repeat the words that Burns wrote or put in the mouth of Robert the Bruce before the Battle of Bannockburn. And it was only last night I watched a program that Neil Oliver does, and he was doing, it's called The Clans, and he did a rerun of Bannockburn. And you know, when you study the military tactics of that battle, how the Scots won it was sheer military genius and a lot of luck. But so Scots Wha Hae, Tea Moose, and Death and Dr. Hornbook. And these are my three stalwarts. These are my three favourite ones. If I'm thinking about nature, then I can't go past the Birks of Aberfeldy. So everybody's got their favourites. I mean, I know that Tam O'Shanter's very popular with people, and I like Tam O'Shanter. I've seen it done brilliantly. I've also seen it slaughtered. But for me, it's the words and the context of Hornbook. You know, that the last few lines, and just as he began to tell, the old Kirkhammer strack the bell, some wee short hour ayont the twal that raised us baith. He took the way that pleased himself. I took the way that pleased myself instead of death. And I just love all that language in that poem, because you had to understand Scots to grasp it. The clachan yill had made me canty. I wasn't a fool, but just had plenty. I staggered whiles, but yet took tent I to free the ditches and hillock stains and bushes kenned I frae ghaists and witches. It's one of those creepy poems that just grasp you. And I have recited it, you know, at the house a couple of times, and at one or two other burn suppers. So those three poems, Jim, they're it for me. And when I learnt Death and Dr. Hornbook, I've learnt Tam as well, but when I learned that, I used to just sit in the car and recite it line after line. And within a couple of months, I had it off by heart. But you both know this. you can learn something off by heart, but the minute you stand up on your two hind legs,
Yeah, good there.
aye, and
Up
what
to
was
that
it?
ball.
What is it? There's a brilliant phrase, the most powerful laxative in the world is public speaking. And speaking of that, you know, I remember the most frightening Burns immortal memory I ever gave was my very first one, because there were two judges sitting in the audience, one called Betty Haining and the other one called Rose Edgar. And I thought, oh my God, if I get something wrong here, I've had it. And sure enough, when I sat down, I got the finger from Betty Haining. Here, I'm going to tell you what you did wrong there, you know. And that was my apprenticeship, and great fun, because I used to meet them time and time again at all the different on the circuit, you know. And Betty's still going strong, by the way.
Betty's a wonderful. I mean, my wife adores Betty Haining.
Yeah.
She just adores her. She's a lovely, lovely lady.
Oh, she is. She's a great, great nature and an inspiration. And she's an inspiration behind a number of wee clubs. Particularly attends Terregel's Burns Supper. Terregel's is a wee village just outside Dumfries. And, you know, it's one of the couthiest Burns suppers you'll ever attend. Oh, there's wee Star on the move.
Yeah.
We're on the move, wee one.
Right.
That's that. Aye, so a great affection for both those ladies.
See, just in that flavour, I mean, you've been all over the world to Burns suppers, and you've been involved with the Burns movement in Scotland, as you say, for over 30 years. You must have met an awful lot of characters in the Burns movement. You know, I mean, who stands out in your mind? I mean, Davy Smith, for example, must be playing a part in your memories of Burns and stuff like that.
Aye. Davy Smith and I go back a long way. And Davy was always very supportive. He's a supportive of everyone who sits in the presidential chair. You cannot sit in the chair without knowing that Davy is at your right hand, right? And if there's something you need to know, he's there. But he's a bit like Betty Haining, because whenever I did any speeches or toasts or anything for David, I would always look over and he'd be mouthing something like 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10. just to keep you on your toes, you know. But a phenomenal Burnsian. It's been a pleasure for me to have known David all these years. You should know, gentlemen, that he has retired from the secretaryship, but he's still there. Because Davy Miller has.
He's still the secretary.
You know what I mean? It's like he's sitting there like the Damoclean sword, waiting for Davy to get it wrong, if you know what I mean. Anyway, he's got it can only be an illustrious career. I cannot think of people. I cannot think of individual people who have left their mark on me. I can think of individual Burns suppers that I've enjoyed. And the reason I'm saying that, I don't mean that negatively. I mean, I've met so many, many talented people that have stood up and recited and sang or played an instrument. And it's been one of the pleasures of my social life to have attended what I think have been some of the best Burns suppers ever. I'm going to tell you, this is a wee bit of a blow here. One of the best, and Leslie will tell you this, was just a couple of years after I was president, I said to Leslie, we'll have a wee Burns supper in the house. Oh yeah, well, you'll not get anybody. You'll not get anybody to come because they're all out doing their immortal memories or their poems or whatever. So I said, right, we'll have it in February. And I got the creme de la creme of Dumfriesshire. 20 individuals came to the house. And I had a couple of visitors. And I think we put 4 or 5 big tables together and a massive tablecloth about the size of a tent. And everybody sat round and each of them got up and did their turn. Now, gentlemen, a lot of these people that were at that Burns supper are now passed on. But I can tell you, Leslie will tell you, that for her and for me was the pinnacle of listening to a Burns supper. I had Ian Whitehead, Jim McCambley, my piper was a relative, and Jim Hainan, Byers, Les Byers, you know, all these kind of guys round that table. And as you know, with Les Byers, if you mention something, he can give you a whole encyclopedic chapter about Burns. So that night, you know, the sangs and clatter went on that night for hours and hours. And I had to pour them out of the house. But for me, and honestly, for me, that was the creme de la creme. And I've been to Burns suppers in some of the poshest places. But if you think about Burns's own social life, that was the kind of social gathering that he enjoyed, was with a few friends. And I must tell you this wee thing. Burns died in July. And I said to Chris Lyon, who is also a past president of the House, said, we should really think about, you know, commemorating Robert Burns's passing. And a good 20 years ago, Chris and I set up a wee group, a wee club of our own called the Royal Dumfries Volunteers. And I'll just show you this. I'll just show you this photograph. What we did was we decided the club needed to have a uniform. So we copied the Royal Dumfries Volunteers uniform and we went to the minutes of the meetings, because the Volunteers was formed by Colonel de Peyster to defend Dumfries against the Napoleonic invasion. And what we do, or what we did up until COVID, was we meet or met every year in the Globe, in the room that is still there as a historic room, in the snug, not the snug, but the other room, which is below the committee room. And Jane Brown, the proprietrix, I used to organize every year a fine supper for the volunteers. And who qualified to be a volunteer? Well, you had to be a Burns enthusiast who was known for either delivering an immortal memory, singing a song, or playing an instrument, or reciting a poem. Now, have a look at these guys. You'll know most of them. You've got Rob Wilson there. Can you see anybody else?
Chris Rowley.
Chris Rowley's there.
Jim Brown.
Jim Brown, Les Byers, right? Callum Watson, right? An absolutely select club. And the beauty of the volunteers is if you attend the supper, you've got to get up and do a turn. So it's a great wee night. It's very, very inclusive. It's a small atmospheric room. It's the room where Burns used to sit. And we know that he would get the paper delivered. The paper would come down from Edinburgh by stagecoach. Somebody would go out and get the paper. I think it was the Edinburgh Courier. I'm not sure if that's the correct name, but it was the Edinburgh paper. It came in, spread on the table. They would have porter or ale, and he would sit and discuss the politics of the time with his cronies. And it's just a marvelous, marvelous experience, a Royal Volunteer supper. Now, you need to know that the globe has been taken over.
Yeah.
The Maqueros sold it. And there's a very interesting man called David Thompson who came to Annan and spent quite a few millions rebuilding the distillery at Annan, a new whiskey distillery. And he's also now taken ownership of the globe. And I'm delighted because there was a time when, you know, I'm not saying it was under threat, but there was a time when it needed a facelift, and it certainly has that now. So that's the Royal Dumfries Volunteers. And I'm still, the other interesting thing about these boys, they've all got a name. So there's Colonel De Peister, there's Captain John Hamilton. Every one of us has a name taken from the minute book of the volunteers, which is in it's in the research section of the Ewart Library.
Peter, you've been doing some work for the Scottish Government. Can you tell everybody about that?
Yeah, well, towards the end of my career, I spent the last 10 years working at national level. 5 of those with Education Scotland as an advisor, and then the last 5 as a senior educational advisor with the Scottish Government itself. Our boss was Mike Russell, and as the minister, and we went around Scotland. It was a very interesting time, Jim, because we were trying to talk to head teachers about children's careers and saying to them, look, Scotland needs more scientists, it needs more technologists, it needs this, that, you know, this idea of every child having to go to university and pick an academic subject, sometimes an obscure subject. Do we really want kids coming out of university with degrees that make them unemployable? Would you rather they came out of school into apprenticeships, etc.? So we're promoting parity of esteem between educational achievement and vocational careers and vocational qualifications. And as you know now, the country is in desperate need of engineers, technical people, people that know the building trade, the carpentry trade, all of that. We're needing far more hands-on people. So it was like a mission. And I'm pleased to say a lot of head teachers have got their eye on the ball. They look at a child now and think, I'm going to point that child to a career that's appropriate for that child. So I'm delighted that we've got these kind of people in the influential posts that they occupy. And I would have enjoyed working on it that, but you know, come 65, well, I've worked a hard 40 odd years or 45 years, time to throw in the towel. And now what I've done now is I've spent the last 5 years writing up a PhD thesis.
So we should have introduced you as Dr. Peter.
Well, yeah, some people don't. Some people have a different title for me. Yes. No, I must tell you why I did this. I'm very proud of the 2 cultures that have influenced my life. My mother's Scottish culture and my father's Ukrainian culture. And because my dad came here as a prisoner of war and his pals came as exiles and displaced persons, no one had written up any history of the last 70 years of Ukrainians being in Scotland. No one. So if somebody didn't write that up, they could have come and gone almost without trace. So what I did was I enlisted with Glasgow University with the Central and Eastern European Studies and asked my professors if they would allow me to write up a PhD about the Ukrainian diaspora in Scotland. And so I set off doing that. And I managed to produce one. Now it's very academic, so if you were having trouble sleeping, it would set you off. So what I've done is I've launched into a second version of this in a more populist language, and that's what's going to take up my time for the next year or two. And I'm delighted to have kicked off that, because so many people have been in touch with me and sent me the most amazing photographs of things that have happened. So I now have a book that will not just be full of words, but very graphic, very interesting. So that's what I'm up to at the moment.
Excellent. And which parts of Scotland did most Ukrainians settle in?
Well, they settled where the textile factories were. So, and heavy industry.
Yeah.
Because they were brought over to do farming. When they were brought from Germany, they were brought as part of a labour shortage in 1946. The Labour government brought them over, and the contract that they had to sign was with farms, forests, mines, or textile factories. So the big Ukrainian communities in Scotland are Edinburgh, used to be Glasgow. There's new ones in Glasgow, Dundee, and then the smaller textile towns like Galashiels, Hoyk, Selkirk, that kind of thing. And down here in Annan and Dumfriesshire, it was with the Ministry of Defence producing gunpowder and military chemicals. So that's where so these are the communities that have come and gone. Because the sad thing is, Douglas, my dad's generation have passed away. Mm-hmm. They're all gone. And the last wee remnant of them being here is a wee chapel in the prisoner of war camp at Lockerbie, which is well visited. But that's the only physical evidence that's left. So and in fact, I'm a trustee of that. So I'm part of the group that's trying to look after it. And please visit it. If you're down this way and you see a brown Historic Scotland sign that says Ukrainian POW Chapel, then come along, because it's worth looking at. So there you are.
Good to make a point of that. You before we started recording, you were telling us a bit of a story about the clippers in the Solway.
Yes, I was going to say to you, you asked me about Burns and Annan, and one of the things that Annan had in Burns's time was a thriving port, because in those days it was silt free. And Burns came down to do his excise work. And if you know anything about shipping history, the port at Annan was famous for a number of clippers, but the most famous was called the Queensbury. And the Queensbury used to race the Cutty Sark back and forward to China and bring back whatever they were bringing back, mostly tea. But it was a fine looking ship. And sadly did not last the length of time that the Cutty Sark did, but it was a competitor. So when Burns came to Annan, Port Street had been well built of local sandstone, with very sturdy houses, warehouses, pubs, brothels, pubs, and various other sort of buildings all the way down, and he would have had a very interesting visit, partaking of all the local services.
And getting back to the clippers, do we know that in these challenges between the Queensbury and the Cutty Sark, do we know who won the most times?
Well, you know this. It's usually the Cutty Sark, right?
Wallace invested an awful lot of money in that boat.
Aye, or so we're told, you know. There's no video film to prove it.
Well, I think the only thing you can say for the end of this episode would be Well done, Cutty Sark.
Well done. Very good. Very good.
We're coming to a close. It just leaves me to say, Peter, thanks very much for telling us about your life with Robert Burns. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I wish you every success in future programs too. Well done.